He always believed wealth could buy silence. And in a way, it did the kind of silence that bows to luxury, that hides between glass and marble, that mixes with the muffled tick of a Swiss clock marking minutes nobody really lives. But that particular night, silence was not for sale. It felt uneasy, electric. A silence that seemed to breathe with him, as if he'd been invited to the most exclusive dinner of his life. The table was set for one, always for one. Fine porcelain, silverware that reflected the city's lights thousands of floors below, and a glass of wine he didn't touch. The liquid sat still, waiting for a decision that never came. The apartment hovered between absolute luxury and an emptiness so deep it echoed in every hidden corner. Standing before that solitary banquet, something in his chest began to tighten. Not physical pain, something older, harder to name. A warning, an omen. The first crack in the armor of the man everyone called the investor who turned anything into gold. He knew somewhere that gold also burns. Outside, the city pulsed, but he barely noticed. His eyes were fixed on a small, unsigned note left on the Platino perfume. No flourish, only a short, cruelly honest line, "I don't know who you are anymore." The blow didn't come from the market, the economy, or a miscalculated trade. It came from the only voice he could never buy, the one voice that still mattered. If this story is touching you, comment below where you're watching from and what time it is there. The phrase hung in the room like an emotional pause, an invitation, a mirror. He rose slowly, as if his body weighed more than it should. He walked to the window. The city lay out like a sea of lights, but nothing calmed him. He had always predicted market movements with ease, but he couldn't predict his own unraveling. He remembered who he used to be, the young, studious, hungry man who loved risk and the power of turning numbers into destiny. He recalled the first big win, the first million. The first time he believed being at the top meant belonging to himself. Now, looking at his shadow in the glass, he barely recognized the man staring back. Silence returned, intimate, almost cruel. He tried to breathe deeply. The air felt stuck in a chest that had forgotten how to find peace. For a brief, almost imperceptible moment, he felt something collapse, not outside, but inside. The banquet sat like a sentence. In the days that followed, he did what he always did when threatened. He worked harder. He drowned himself in charts, projections, reports that seemed to shift expression each time he blinked. But for the first time, the data wouldn't obey him. The market rose and fell like an unpredictable animal, and the man who found patterns in chaos now heard only noise. Colleagues noticed. The team noticed. Even clients picked up a discord in his voice, a hesitation that had never been there. No one spoke. He remained a legend, the architect of wealth, but the cost of that legend was something everyone felt except him. Small details revealed the void. In the panoramic elevator, where he used to admire the city as an extension of himself, he now saw only distorted reflections of sleepless nights. In meetings, his mind wandered to the letter on the table, to the cold line telling him she no longer recognized the man he'd become. The private empire didn't crumble outwardly, it collapsed inwardly. One strategic presentation, he froze. The laser pointer rested on a graph, but his mind stalled. Silence bloomed in the room, not the elegant hush of a high-stakes boardroom, but the uncomfortable quiet that exposes weakness. "Are you okay?" someone asked. He forced a smile, forced an answer, forced normalcy. But the crack had opened. He started looking for odd refugees, aimless late-night walks, unfinished cigarettes, quick sips of whiskey that burned more than they soothed. Rituals that once steadied him, gym sessions, precise schedules, meditation began to fail. Something in him refused discipline. External fractures followed a deal lost by the narrowest margin, a partner calling him out for impulsive moves, an influential client hinting they preferred another manager. Small slips, small betrayals, little truths he ignored while his own soul imploded in silence. The worst rupture came from inside. One Sunday night, sitting in the dark sofa lit only by the city, he tried to remember the last time he'd felt peace. He dug through memory and found nothing. Nothing. Peace had become a language he once spoke fluently, but now only recognized at a distance, like a foreign phrase. The realization, The letter, and then the admission that something inside was cracking, was the second step toward the fall. The more he hid the cracks, the more they multiplied. The empire stood, the man began sinking. The loss arrived quietly. No scandal, no bankruptcy, no public collapse. It came the way deepest losses do, politely, almost respectfully, asking permission before entering, and by the time he noticed, the rooms inside had already been emptied. On a regular Thursday, long after the office had emptied, he stayed behind under the cold glow of monitors and the distant city. His phone buzzed, a short message, from someone who once occupied a huge space in his life, now speaking like a stranger. Don't contact me anymore. I need peace. Simple words, final. Something in him went dark. Not like a snap, not an explosion, like a light quietly switched off. He dropped the phone on the desk and stared at the glass, at the reflection of a precise, polished man with eyes pleading for help, eyes he had never let himself show. The phrase echoed, "I need peace." The irony was brutal. She had spent years trying to offer him peace, while he offered only deadlines, pressure, and absence. Isolation wrapped around him like a second skin. He went down to the garage, sat in the car, didn't start the engine, he only sat. Fingers on the steering wheel as if that familiar object were the sole thing that made sense. The concrete felt like closure, but the real pressure was inside. Outside, the city continued, horns, laughter, noise, but it all seemed to happen on a different planet. He came home to an apartment that swallowed him. Photographs, mementos, bright things he once loved returned nothing but cold. No vivid memory remained, neglect had taken them too. He sat on the living room floor in the dark and realized for the first time he had everything except peace. The loss was no longer of someone, it was of himself. The way back, if there was one, would be longer than any route he'd ever taken to the top. The next morning dawned grey. He'd spent the night on the floor, eyes hollow but aware. When the sun finally pushed through curtains, it brought not relief, but awareness, and awareness weighs far heavier than any financial loss. He moved slow, like a man carrying decades. He opened the fridge, not hungry. He stood in front of the sink, too drained to turn the tap. His reflection in the mirror looked older, harder, full of secrets and silences. There, he admitted, the fall didn't start yesterday. It began with tiny choices he'd deemed harmless: late nights, cancelled dinners, calls traded for marginal gains. He'd always promised himself peace later. Later never came. He decided to leave, not in the Karen foot. He walked the manicured streets like an intruder in his own life. The wind cut his face and carried memories he'd tried to bury. On that walk, the memory of that first night returned whole: the single plate, the untouched wine, the blunt note, "I don't know who you are anymore." This time he saw details. He'd missed a chair slightly askew, as if someone had sat and waited too long, a damp spot on the napkin. The letter left precisely at the plate's center, the last small act of hope before giving up. He hadn't looked. He had chosen not to. Sitting on a park bench, hands on his knees, the city flowed around him. People moved, walking, laughing, living, and there he stood, trapped between who he had been and who he could yet become. Memories rose like stones in his chest. The birthday missed for a position. The personal call disconnected for a client. The nights he lied him on my way when hours of work still waited. Each recollection a hit, each hit a new truth. A pigeon landed nearby, a small, ordinary detail that unsettled him. He realized it had been years since he'd noticed anything so simple. He had lived where small things meant nothing. Small gestures are the first casualties when someone loses peace. And that was exactly what he'd lost before losing anyone else: the capacity to feel what cannot be measured in numbers. He stood with a clarity that wasn't redemption, but lucidity. That clarity is the beginning of change. Back at the apartment, he did not run. He sat at the table that had witnessed his collapse and breathed. He opened a drawer and found a stack of neglected notes letters from people who once tried to reach him. "Come back early, don't forget to rest, we're waiting." He'd ignored them. Now they returned like echoes. His first honest act, he wrote a letter. Not polished, not digital handwritten, trembling. No promises, no demands. I understood too late. But I understood, he wrote. He left it at her building, not expecting reconciliation, only offering truth. The second action, he faced his routine. He turned off notifications, cancelled meetings, loosened his grip on an empire he'd obsessively controlled. Partners were suspicious, the team puzzled. He began delegating and apologizing. He named mistakes aloud. Vulnerability stung more than any market loss, but it set others free. He visited a small cafe he'd loved years ago and drank the plain coffee he used to. The taste brought back a man who still existed, maybe not whole, but salvageable. He sought an old friend he'd pushed away. Their talk was brief and raw. No laughter, no dramatic reconciliation, only a shared recognition of being lost and, perhaps, the first steps toward finding a way back. Small gestures, little cures, imperfect, humane. One rainy night, he returned to the office to slip an old photo into a drawer, a picture of himself before the peak, before emptiness. He didn't keep it as a relic of loss, but as a beacon for what he could rebuild. He closed the drawer and felt for the first time that peace might have room to grow. Morning came honest and grey. He woke different, restless, but not consumed. The restlessness wasn't a wave anymore, it was a trace. He went to the balcony and watched the city as people moved below. He no longer stood above them, but beside them, flawed, human, equal. His phone vibrated, a reply to the letter. I received it. Processing it. Thank you. No promises, no immediate reconciliation, only space. Space was precious. Then the office called an extraordinary meeting. His recent behavior, absences, mistakes, everything was on the table. The board's language was clinical instability, risk, best for the company. He listened, he accepted the consequences. When they offered him a voluntary resignation, he signed. The pen moved slowly. At once, a surprising lightness came. It felt like returning a burden that never belonged solely to him. Outside, the wind was a relief. No motorcade, no fanfare, just him, and a city breathing real life. He wandered until he found a park he had always ignored for being too ordinary. He sat on a bench and watched children run. Age-old couples stroll, people living lives that cost nothing and gave everything. As the sun painted the sky copper and violet, he understood true wealth was never what he'd accumulated. It was what he had stopped cultivating. Perhaps there was still time to plant something new. He opened his phone and typed not a report or a plan, but a simple message. If you ever want to talk, I'm here. No pressure, no expectation, just presence, the most expensive thing he hadn't known how to offer. That evening, the apartment felt different. The silence was pliable now, not empty and heavy, but room-making. He left the keys on the marble and walked into the living room by the city's soft glow. On the same table where his fall had begun, he found a small leather bookmark. Folded, worn, with a handwritten note tucked inside, for when you finally stop. He recognized the handwriting, someone he had lost. A gesture left before the rupture, before the absolute silence. Not an accusation, but a compass. He'd never seen it. He'd never understood that before leaving, she'd left him a guide, a tiny, patient instruction to learn how to be. Holding the bookmark like something alive, he felt the luxury around him quiet. The city still shone, but he could now distinguish distant music, the flow of cars. Life that didn't belong to his ledger, and somehow it welcomed him back. All his life he'd mistaken motion for purpose, wealth for worth, speed for meaning. Now he felt how hollow those substitutions were when held by empty hands. He leaned back, closed his eyes, and took a breath that felt like a small beginning. He didn't know if reconciliation would come. He didn't know if ties could be rebuilt. He only knew this: he'd finally stopped running. And sometimes, stopping is the first and most courageous investment anyone can make.